Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Benashova, Benashova, Chodesh, Chodesh, Yameinu Kekedem. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Venashova, Venashova, Chodesh, Chodesh, Yameinu Kekedem. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Venashova, Venashova, Chodesh, Chodesh, Yameinu Kekedem. Good evening, friends. Glad to be with you all. And thanks for coming back. This is our second to last session, which is a little bittersweet for me. It's been quite a challenging topic to study. I mean, in a good way. And you all have been a challenging group in a good way. I mean, in the sense that we're reading this book and she's got amazing ideas that work really well, a really amazing paradigm for the examples she brings. And then you all keep bringing really complicating questions, which I think is so excellent. And I really appreciate it. So I'm a little sad that we're coming to an end. So I want to start by just explaining a little bit of my thinking in having lost a class session instead of trying to scrunch 3 chapters into 2 sessions. I was rereading chapter 6 and thinking, this is a really important chapter for a book about repentance and repair. But I also felt that the Jewish textual content was the weakest in that chapter, which is to say, like, there's a lot of really interesting things to be said about what a just criminal justice system and the challenges of restorative justice, reparative justice practices can look like. But they were said very beautifully by Rabbi Ruttenberg, and they are said beautifully by other people. And I'm not sure that there's like so much to unpack that looking at it further from a synagogue Jewish lens brings. Whereas I think I really did not want to have to spend less than a session on a conversation about forgiveness. And so with that, and if you have requests for me about how I go back to chapter 6 before we close at the end of next session, I'm happy to consider that. But I want to start by talking about something that happens frequently from where I sit as rabbi, which is I counsel people, not infrequently, who come to me struggling with, say, the death of a parent or relative, or someone who has harmed them, and their self-judgment around not having forgiven them. And I say to them, well, you have internalized Christian hegemony, because there's no Jewish obligation to forgive someone who harmed you and was never repentant about it. And there's only a very weak Jewish obligation to forgive someone who harmed you and was truly penitent about it. And even then, only if they did a really good job and really repaired the harm they did and proved it really well. And usually the people I'm talking to are not in situations where that has happened. In fact, I've never talked to someone who's been in a situation where that has happened. And from what I have observed, that is incredibly liberating for people, and somewhat mind-blowing. And of course I say, like, by all means, to the extent that you can let go of having your life hung up on your rage at these people, great, but that's for you. You don't owe them anything. And so forgiveness, both the offering of it and the withholding of it, is a very powerful thing. And it's, as Rabbi Ruttenberg wrote about in her book, a very weaponized thing in Christian hegemonic culture. And I'm interested in how you guys are going to problematize it for me tonight, because I have found it's one of the most powerfully distinct things I can offer people as a rabbi when they come to me for counseling, that is distinct from what a different kind of counselor offers people when they come for counseling. So we're going to get into discussing some of the concepts in the book around forgiveness, but first, does anyone want to tell any interesting or troubling case studies on forgiveness? Okay. Oh, Carrie Ray, go ahead and unmute.
When you say case study, are you talking about, for example, a personal?
It could be, yeah.
Well, I'm going back to the whole issue of forgiving someone who is forgiving or not forgiving. What you do with someone who has died, who has hurt you, and had during life refused to acknowledge. And what I experienced is a lot of years of anger over not getting an apology, without of not getting, this was apparent, not getting acknowledgement even prior to death, trying to discuss it. And we're talking 30 years of a cyclic sort of rumination, sometimes more frequent than others. And I just had to do a lot of writing. I had to do an awful lot of writing and acknowledge the good, acknowledge the bad, recognize that I was not going to get what I thought that I should have gotten, and there was no way to get it. And I also had to look at my own behavior in terms of the lack of understanding, lack of things that I was participating in also. And it took nearly 40 years to do that whole process.
Mm.
But that's when, and I can't remember the Mishala, what's the word? The it's done.
Mechila.
Mahila, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
There is no more anger. There's no more expectation. That, but it just took an awful long time to do it and figure out a process that would work with me. So that was.
Thank you for sharing, Gary Ray. And you know what you're saying makes me think, it's very clear when you go through that process, you're doing it for you, right? You went through that for the sake of your own psycho-spiritual health. That is the convenient thing about when somebody who has done wrong dies. I mean, God forbid, no one should die without having made amends for what they did wrong, but of course, it happens all the time. And there's an interesting teaching in Masechet Yoma that death atones for our sins. And I have so many questions spiritually about what that means. But I think one thing that it means is that, when we die, we're, I hope, no longer in a place to continue to perpetrate and exacerbate the wrongs that we have done. And so those who have been harmed can be more free to be clear about what process they even want, right? You get to have mechila because you get to recognize what you need in terms of closure and do the process to get there. And it's in a great way not about the parent at that point. I'm going to turn off the recording for a moment. Yeah. Rabbi Ruttenberg uses two phrases to describe forgiveness. One is mechila, which, as she puts it, just being willing to close the book and move on, which means I no longer want to think about anything as the person who has received harm. I'm done thinking about this. I'm not actively being harmed anymore. I can be over it. And it doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the relationship goes back to the way it was before. Doesn't mean you have to let the SOB back in your life. It just means there's nothing on that whatever needed to be resolved to move on is done. That's mechila. There's then salicha, which is a little bit more like the pop cultural version of forgiveness, of forgive and forget. Our relationship is gonna be even stronger than it was before. We love each other, and we're gonna let someone back into our life. I mean, salicha, as she writes, doesn't even necessarily mean that, but it is closer to the general pop meaning of forgiveness, of actively wishing someone well and moving on together as opposed to separately. So I'm very interested in just what we, like what actually having two different words for those concepts does for us. And that's one question I wanted to ask us. So let's talk about what it does for us to have two different words that parse out different nuances of what this English language word forgiveness might mean. How does it feel to say there's never an obligation for slicha, for, you know, resuming a relationship as if nothing bad ever happened? And sometimes there might be an obligation for mechila in certain circumstances, saying, I'm done here. We don't have to go over this anymore. Does this feel useful? Does it open up possibilities for you? Ellen, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Could you give an example of like when mechila might be like what you just said, possibly urged or required?
Well, in Maimonides' framework, according to halacha, a person is required to give mechila if a reparable wrong has been repaired. Meaning,
Oh,
I stole from you and I've confessed it, returned the item, apologized profusely, and declared that I will never do that again.
oh, so that is required. If the person fully repented and made amends, you
According,
you need to move on and let go of it.
you need to move on and let go of it once they have apologized 3 times with witnesses and requested mechila after fully making amends. And that's the order, right? Like you're not allowed to request forgiveness until you make restitution and apologize and with witnesses, promise to never repeat the wrong and ask for mechila. According to Maimonides, at that point, one is sort of on the hook to say, yes, we can be done now. Barbara?
I'm trying to think how this applies to children. There's a real knee-jerk thing now with kids where one kid clobbers another kid or something, and a parent or a caretaker says, say sorry, and the kid says sorry. And the whole interchange seems a little weird to me. And I was wondering if you could comment about all of this in terms of child rearing.
What I observe from my children is that children are really good at giving mechila. I mean, from when I think about interactions that happen daily in my family, where my kids get into a fuss, as one of my daughters calls it, and are really mad at each other, and one kid like aggresses against the other. Usually, my husband and I are upset and like problematizing the situation long after the other child is like over it. I'm done. I got the toy back. I don't care that she called me a name. I got the toy back. I don't even care that she hit me because I'm done. Like I'm fine now. And so, which is not to say like you can give mechila before someone fully repents. And look, with children's moral education, you can't make someone do teshuva. All you can try to do is teach them to want to do teshuva. And teach them and model it for them, right? So as a parent, when I hurt my child, which I might do by hurting her feelings, or I might do by, grabbing her when I'm really angry. I can't make her do teshuva in those moments when I'm really angry at her, but I can do teshuva for how I express the anger. I can admit that I'm a fallible person that doesn't do things right and then has to take responsibility for it. And with one of my children, there's been a lot of resistance to cleaning up messes lately. And I say, like, look, making a mess doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you're a person who now has a mess you need to clean up. And it's not a big deal unless you get into a big fuss about not wanting to ever clean up a mess. And again, like, truthfully, this is something I need to own, because physically, when it comes to messes, I'm actually very bad at cleaning up my own messes. And I let my husband like clean up dinner all the time. So, she's getting from somewhere a resistance to cleaning up messes. So like all we can do is our own teshuva and modeling that. But I think children are actually very good at letting go when restitution has been made. And they know, they're good at knowing the difference between someone who is just going to be chronically untrustworthy and someone who is in my corner and did something that hurt me, but I'm over it. I hope that was a helpful musing. Leah?
The conversation brought up a story that I'll paraphrase very poorly that my son told me a long time ago when he was in high school. And it had to do with a young man who said some things that were hurtful, and then he apologized. And then the father made him go hammer all these nails in a fence and then pull out all the nails. And was showing him that just because you pull out the nails, the holes are still there, and your words, even if you apologize, you still cause that pain, and that how that impacted someone can't erase how that might impact them the rest of their lives. I'm paraphrasing it horribly, but I thought that was just so potent and painful to me. That idea is that, right, even if you're so apologetic, those nails were even you pull out the nails, the holes are still there. So I don't know what to do with that, but somehow it seemed wanted to be said in this conversation.
Yeah, I've heard that story, like with a feather pillow, right? A woman goes to a rabbi saying, I realize I've said some terrible things about my neighbor and I shouldn't do that anymore. What do I need to do to make up for it? And the rabbi says, well, take a feather pillow and tear it open in the marketplace and scatter the feathers everywhere, and then come back. So she does, and the rabbi says, good, now go and collect every single feather and put it back in the pillow. Which is actually, like as a metaphor, great, but as an answer to doing teshuva, terrible, because we have an obligation to do teshuva even for things that are irreparable, right? It's not enough to just like learn a lesson of, oh, that's irreparable, I'm a terrible person. So, it's tempting to make that leap that because some harms are irreparable and therefore one does not have the right to ask for forgiveness, that one shouldn't do teshuva. One should still, if one has slandered another person, do all the steps of teshuva, confess, I said this thing that was not true and was not fair, apologize, try to make it right, try to correct and protect the person's reputation in the future, perhaps. And then one should also accept the fact that it might not ever actually be forgivable because it might not be reparable. And I think like one of the needles Rabbi Ruttenberg threads really beautifully is like pointing out that accepting I might not be forgiven, and that's okay because my teshuva process isn't about the person I harmed forgiving me, is a really important part of the teshuva process. Doesn't mean I am a terrible person forever. Doesn't mean I can't do better. and learn not to repeat the harm, but it means like I'm not going to get the absolution I want from the person that I harmed this time in this way. And I do think the concept of mechila, of expecting the former victim to be willing to close the book and say, we're done, you don't owe me anything anymore, really works best with tangible harms. Tangible harms that can be healed. Okay, you hit me with a car, but you paid my medical bills, and now you're a more careful driver. Yes, we can have mechila. You stole something from me, but you paid it back. Yes, we can have mechila. It's the intangibles that are more irreparable. Julie, go ahead.
I think this is a question that maybe was covered weeks ago in this process, but what happens if the person who you feel harmed you doesn't realize they did? So you're not going to get, they're not going to come to you and do anything. Is it that if you want to have that process, you have to go to the person and say you did this thing, which is such a hard thing to do. I mean, so what
have we talked about tochacha? It's the best mitzvah. Okay, I'm gonna just like pull it up in its context because it's so powerful, and its limitations are also very powerful. So in Leviticus, in the Holiness Code, chapter 19, which starts, you shall be holy, for I, Hashem, your God, am holy, we have this mitzvah. And I'm going to show it to you on Safaria. Lo tisne et achicha bilvavecha hocheach tochiach et amitecha lo tisa alav chet. You shall not hate your sibling in your heart. You shall certainly reprove your kinfolk and don't bear guilt on their account. And then the next verse is lo tikom velo titor et bnei amecha ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Adonai, which is one of the most famous phrases in Tanakh. Don't take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow as yourself. I am Hashem. So there's a mitzvah to reprove someone who has done wrong instead of bearing a grudge. And then in the halachic literature that gets refined as clearly this is reproof for the sake of relationship. So when you have a relationship with someone that matters, you have to reprove them when they've done wrong so that they know, so that they can do better. Now, when that reproof is not going to accomplish anything because the person is not going to care because you're not in relationship in the first place, that mitzvah does not apply. It's not a mitzvah to get yourself into if you're already in a power differential, for example, and very vulnerable, it's not a mitzvah to make yourself more vulnerable by confronting someone directly. But in a case of presumptive equality of power in a relationship that matters, it's a mitzvah to face the discomfort and say, hey, we need to have a hard conversation about this thing that I am holding because you shall not bear hatred in your heart. You shall reprove your neighbor. Isn't it great that that's a commandment? I just love that that's a commandment in Judaism.
But so you're saying that's if you're in a relationship with a person, so that for the sake of the community, the relationship in the community. But if you're not, then
right. Maimonides says you're absolved from hocheach tochiach, from you. It's It's a grammatical form where the root is repeated twice, which intensifies it. So it doesn't just say you shall reprove your neighbor. It says like reprovingly you shall reprove your neighbor, which often is translated as like you shall surely reprove your neighbor. Only applies when there is a reasonable hope that the person will listen, that it will make an impact. Which look means that it doesn't mean you have to be sure it will make an impact. If there's a reasonable hope that it will make an impact, you're supposed to try. But it's also like, right, it's not a mitzvah of heroics. So she has an example that we read a couple weeks ago of someone who like wrote back compassionate reproof to someone who'd been trolling her online, and that made an impact and the person wound up doing teshuvah. It's like, that's great if it works. That's not a heroic level that like we're not all expected to do that. We're not expected to give loving reproof to the people who troll us. Gary, go ahead. Gary Ray.
So I think this sort of relates, and I'm at a quandary regarding the mitzvah of reproving, because I am concerned that if I reprove this person, meaning I tell them things that I have repetitively seen that doesn't make for a good friendship, I'm not sure I want them to do to make amends, because I don't think I want to continue the relationship even at this point. But at the same time, they may not know why I don't. So yeah.
I think the second, like, I think the fact that it's the second clause of a verse is really important. You shall not hate your neighbor or bear a grudge against your people. You shall not hate your sibling or bear a grudge against your people, but you shall reprove your neighbor. If you're going to be carrying this around and seething and rolling your eyes at this person, then you're like in violation of this mitzvah. If you're like, look, I don't like your behavior, but mechila, I'm happy to move on and be done, then it doesn't sound like by not reproving the person you'd be in violation. You know, in the general net good in the universe, one might say it's probably still a mitzvah to give this person the courtesy of feedback that could make them a better person. But I think as long as you're not, as long as it's not festering in other ways, you're probably not in active violation. Barbara.
Yeah, I just I've had the experience of having friends tell me, you're doing this and it bothers me and it jeopardizes our friendship. And it's great because it enabled me to say, oh man, I didn't know, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And I mean, I don't know what the magnitude of wronging someone is and where it becomes, you just want to write them off. But the times I have had friends say, this thing you do hurts me, and it makes me wonder if we're really friends, was super helpful for me because I could correct that behavior. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah. Look, we all tend to be, well, I shouldn't say that. That's a, never mind. We don't all tend to be anything. Conflict is uncomfortable. Some of us are better at it than others. There's a discussion in the Talmud that I'm like looking for on Safaria right now, because I hate just randomly quoting Talmud without being able to say where it came from, but there I can't find it, and there is a discussion in the Talmud that says like two sages, some sage says there's no one in this generation who's really capable of receiving feedback well, of receiving hocheach tochiach well. And so I was like, yeah, there's no one in this generation who's even capable of giving it well. Um, it takes courage. It takes courage to challenge a status quo in that way. And it's a huge gift. It's a huge gift, especially to people who are capable of receiving it. Okay, so we're going to break into small groups. I'm going to encourage you to look over from page 178 at the bottom to 181 near the top, and a section on page 185. That's actually a lot of text, so I'm going to try to give you a long time. And just, and I'm putting that in the chat. And sort of discuss like what we make of this concept of the limitations on the expectation of forgiveness, but the idea that something should be forgiven for our own sake, as well as, you know, the idea that there are some wrongs that a perpetrator earns the right to have forgiven through the process of teshuvah. What do we make of that concept? How expansive or limited do we think that is? And let's take 25 minutes and then you'll come back together. Sound good? Now, what do you think? Groups of 3 or 4? 4. 4 it is. Okay. Well, I hope you have a great discussion. And oh, it's going to be groups of 3 or 4. Sorry. We don't have an even 20 anymore. And I'll
Rabbi,
see
could
you.
you write what the question is in the chat before we go?
Um,
Because that always comes up sometimes after we're in the group, so I wasn't quite sure what the question was we're discussing.
okay.
Thanks.
All right. There's going to be one group of 5. Sorry. Have fun. Welcome back, everyone. So, Mechila. This is in many ways the chapter that's most focused on the process and potential responsibilities of the person who has been on the receiving end of harm. And I'm curious what insights and intelligence you all discovered in your discussions with each other. about this. Joy, go ahead.
We had such a great discussion. Seriously, I'm like so excited about it. But one thing that Julie brought up, and just kind of we all realized this was true, is we have never really experienced someone truly trying that hard to make amends, who really went through like such a deep, thoughtful process. We haven't had that experience. We've definitely had people come to us sincerely trying to apologize, and they had looked at themselves and looked at their behavior, but someone who had really gone through those steps of teshuva, I don't think we've experienced that. So that was interesting. And then we sort of talked about, we're not really taught how to do that. We don't really learn how to, like, have we ever done that? So it was all quite theoretical because we haven't truly experienced it either as sort of a penitent or the victim. So and that was one of the probably the most powerful things from that discussion.
Yeah, no, like it's a high bar. It's a really high bar. Florence, you're muted.
The thoughts that I came to was when there's a person who wants forgiveness, the first thing they should really do is go to the person they hurt and say, what do you need to, like they're sorry for what they did, but what do you need to have happen to be able to do the, not, necessarily full forgiveness, but just to be able to, get to the point of saying it's over, we don't need to go any further, because that's probably the most important thing of what, so that there's a clear understanding of what they have to do to even get up to that.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think I think I would say that that's true, but like with a caveat, because if a person does that too early, they're a little bit putting emotional labor on the person they've harmed. So I think a person has the responsibility to repair the wrong, to confess and repair the wrong that they know they've done, right? So before I even say, what do you need? What more do you need? Actually, I'm thinking about this. Some of you took God is Here last year, and I publicly embarrassed someone in that class. And I brushed off a question they asked. And before I said, is there anything else I can do to make this right? I publicly apologized and admitted that I had done that. And I did that for all the people who had seen me do that, who had seen me brush off their question. And I think like there is some work that a perpetrator needs to do to say like, I know I did this thing wrong. I know what it would take, at least the first steps of what it would take to fix that, to confess, to like undo that wrong as best as possible. And then once I've done that, it's appropriate to come and say, I feel really bad. Here's what I've done. Is there more that you need from me? But I don't think we can put it entirely on the person we've wronged to spell it all out for us. Do you accept that modification?
Yeah, that could be, if you have some idea, but sometimes the first thing you might do that you think, as the perpetrator would help the situation might be even more uncomfortable for them. It's kind of like, you said there's something wrong with you, or if you said that, there's something wrong with me, in front of a crowd, it might be, from my perspective, you're just bringing up again at a point when I was embarrassed. And I'd rather have you come personally to me and we could just talk about, well, it hurt my feelings, but now that you're here and you're apologizing, I feel better about it. Depending on just what it was. It's sort of like, it reminds me of the story of a little child with his mother on the bus, and somebody with some, maybe they're overweight or there's something different about them. And the little boy says very loudly to his mother, "Oh, look, that lady's so fat." And the mother says, "You must go and apologize to that lady." And he didn't say, "I'm sorry that I said that." He said, "I'm sorry, lady, that you're so fat." So he made the situation twice as bad as it was. And just in case everybody on the bus hadn't heard,
Right.
insult in the first place. So
Yeah.
I think-
Another great example of why we should not attempt to make children apologize.
right, yeah. But it's just the issue of, can you, it may be that the person that's been, depends what the situation is. But it may be that, particularly with somebody who's been very physically vicious, the last thing the victim wants is to have anything to do with that person again. Don't even talk to me, don't come near me, just leave me alone. It just depends on what the situation is. And, but
Yeah, it's a good point. Right. The question, is there anything else you need, should always precede should always, like, you really can't ask, "Are we done?" without asking, "Is there anything else that you need?"
that I fully agree with.
Okay, Barbara, yes.
Well, because I'm listening to all this, and I do think just because in our society people are so not honest with each other about their feelings a lot of the time, that if you think you've hurt someone and I'm not talking about something egregious, but something merely unkind, and you go to them and say, "I'm sorry I said an unkind thing," and 9 times out of 10, people are going to say, "Oh, it's fine, it's no problem," but that doesn't mean they don't appreciate you making the gesture. That's
Right. Or the opposite, where they say it's fine, but something is always off after that, right? They won't really admit the anger or accept the apology. That's a very common and difficult situation. And I think about, I don't know if any of you know Peter and Susan Glazer. I don't know if Peter and Susan Glazer will ever watch this video and see that I'm giving them a shout out. They're TBI members who are experts in the field of communication, especially in like workplaces, and communication, conflict resolution. And they lead all these workshops in corporate settings. But I remember them talking about like a case study where someone says something that really offends someone else, and then it winds up like just exploding a workplace into opposing camps, and the different ways that that situation could and should be diffused early on. And, as I say, like, if you realize, if you feel a little bad and then you see the person giving them a cold shoulder, you get cold shoulder, You can say, you know, I realize the way I tried to give you that feedback may have been offensive, and I'm really sorry, and I want to be open to your perspective on the situation. I'm sorry if what I said came off harsh. I don't want to, I can see how it would be, and I don't want it to be harsh. And if the person responds saying, no, it's fine, you have to take that at face value. You have to say, okay, I'm glad it's fine. Now, if 2 days later they're still giving you a cold shoulder, you can say, I know you said it was fine, and I believe you, but it seems like maybe something is wrong between us. Can we talk about it? You have to still take what they say at face value, because we can never do other people's teshuva for them, and we can never do other people's tochacha for them. And it is like the hardest thing in the world to stay in our own lanes spiritually. And in some ways, I feel like this book is all about like what is and is not in our lane spiritually. Yes, Anne.
The thing that I brought up in our group that still is about scale. You know, we talk about harm, but there's so many different scales. Like we talked about slander being something that was not repairable necessarily. And I read to my group all the other things that people do deliberately to each other, one of which is unfairly lashed out in anger. And there's a whole list on page 24. But I liked having those things that we do intentionally where I need to make change. Like I unfairly lashed out in anger at someone, and that person for repair wanted to do mediation. And I felt that was out of scale to what happened. So, I mean, I'll do mediation with my daughter, but I'm not going to do mediation with a person that's that's somewhat close. So it's sort of like all this discernment about, you can ask somebody how to make amends, and they can tell you, but I think the process is back and forth from my experience. And there is a level of scale, like the priest who molested my brother, or my father who had the affair. They're all different levels of harm. And we can't just dump all those levels into one bucket and say, well, I'm going to go to the victim and ask them what they need to heal every time something goes wrong.
Right. And we talked about this 3 weeks ago when we talked about institutional obligations and the case study of Rabbi Art Green. So like what happens when someone does harm and then the teshuva that is demanded of them seems, at least to some people, to be so disproportionate to the harm actually done that it creates a secondary harm. Like this is the messy world. This is like the messy reality we live in. And I think like this moment, I've been spending more time than is actually useful to me reading, right, leftist critiques of what's happening, what Israel is doing in Gaza, and critiques of leftist rhetoric about what Israel is doing in Gaza. And like the harms just keep compounding and they don't cancel each other, right? It's not like, you know, as my mother would say, two wrongs don't make a right. And yet we're really bad at talking about the compounding harms without making it sound as if they cancel each other. Chris.
Yeah, that made me think of Peter Barnard's article that you sent us last week. And you know, and when our group just talked about the magnitude of things, it seems very pessimistic to say things are too big for teshuva. And I guess I'm an optimist that, you know, that things can be reparable, or at least people can try. And so that, I think, you know, all these things, and it's hard not to think of what's going on in the contemporary arena right now, as you said as well. But I think it's useful to think about that and to think about big scale things, as horrible as they may be, whether it's a personal level or an institutional level, like how can we work to repair things? And can we get some healing? I think it's a useful thing to ponder and not just throw it out the window.
Right. Well, we're probably not going to be good at it with the big things if we don't practice at it with the little things.
Mhm.
So if you want a homework assignment, it's all challenge by choice. Think about a hurt or an irritation you've been carrying that you could give someone tochacha about, that you could give someone reproof about. And, offer them that gift. Usually it works best if you ask first. You say like, there's something bothering me. I have some feedback about it. Are you open to hearing it? When would be a good time? Good luck. And good night.
Good night.